Welcome everybody to a episode of Definitive Analysis, and today we are going to cover Cathedral by Raymond Carver. This is said to be, and I think I might have to fall in line with this perspective, one of the best short stories, if not the best short story of all time. I teach this with the creative writing class that I teach. I kind of save some of the most outstanding material, I feel, the most astounding material for that class, just to really show off the chops of some of these writers. And I think this is a fantastic story with such deep meaning and such relevance. I think I was going to say quickly, I hope everybody had a wonderful new year and a very nice holiday. It is that time of the year where we invite people in, we catch up with old friends, much like the context of this story, Cathedral, with the narrator who is and his wife are bringing in a blind man, right, for a visit, and this is a friend of the wife's, and they haven't seen each other in a very long time, yet they've kept up in a pretty constant correspondence in sharing ideas about their life. And just to be frank, we realize how supportive this has all been for the wife, because she's gone through some trying times, right? So we'll jump right in, all right? But I think a good story for the holidays, considering the sociability, being around everybody, and our attitudes that seem to persist in these wonderful experiences that we do seem to have as well. So here we go. The blind man is the first three words here, this blind man. And the irony is that's exactly where our narrator will be by the end of the story. He essentially kind of goes blind, right? The narrator tells him, the man here, Robert, at that point tells him to close his eyes. So we see that blindness essentially come to fruition by the end of the story. We get a lot of background on this blind man, right? This old friend of his wife's. And then we get a lot of background, substantial background, in the first 2 to 3 pages of this story, which goes on to be, let's see here, just in the PDF that I have here, just onto a 13th page. So a fairly long short story. But the first few pages are dedicated to really learning a lot about his wife and what her experiences were, relationships she had before actually marrying our narrator here. They seem like a fairly new couple, or maybe not too new, but still kind of dealing with the fact that they had lives, pre-existing lives, right, before they hitched. We see this kind of defensive attitude very early on. The narrator says, "He was no one I knew." And we almost get a tinge of the feeling nobody he wants to know, perhaps, right? Like kind of putting up these barriers even before this man has arrived. And maybe he has some good reason to, because he's heard so much about this person leading up to this as well. He says at the end of the first paragraph, "A blind man in my house was not something I looked forward to." And this is ironic too, because we start to recognize early on the need for intimacy in the narrator's life here. It seems to be lacking. It seems to be something he's working on with his wife. I think it is there, which I think leads to some redeeming perspectives on the narrator as well. I don't think, despite these attitudes, I think it's almost a cry for help is one way of understanding it, right? In need of really strong intimacy, and that's a very relevant theme in our lives, especially around the holidays, is the intimacy we might be in need of, and opening up and sharing our things about our lives, the difficulties of our lives with others, right? Moving forward, I think it's important to point out just the simple idea of providing help. How does his wife, the narrator's wife, know this blind man, right? It'll be Robert. We'll get the name soon enough. How does she know Robert? After his wife passed away, he was in need of almost like an assistant, but a very important assistant in the sense that she'll be reading to him, right, and giving him information, right, literally just kind of providing that level of support for this person. What is his job? I guess his wife used to provide this role for him, right? And we find out a little bit more about the wife later on. But just to point out another thing here, his job is a social he works in the county social service department, and there's the emphasis, I think, deliberately on behalf of Carver here, bringing us to the social, because it's so noticeable. That's what's lacking in our narrator, right, is that ability to be social, right? And he seems to have these preconceived perspectives on people even before he meets them that kind of puts him at maybe a disadvantage of some kind. Moving on, we learn about the strange kind of intimate relationship of these friends, the blind man Robert and his wife. She let him explore her because he doesn't have sight. He has to explore people and perhaps even how they look through his sense of touch, right? So he's done that to her. And then on the flip side, she's been trying to write a poem about it. And the poem is interesting early on. We also know Carver was a poet. From what I understand, I've read a good amount of his short fiction, and I think he's one of the strongest going, right? If not the strongest. I never really read too much of his poetry, but I got to be honest, I don't think he's really known too much for his poetry, right? It's really the short stories. But Carver knew what it meant to be a poet, poetic experience, things of that nature, right? It was a big part of his work. So the construction of a poem here on behalf of his wife could also be the construction of a couple other things throughout the text. One could be the construction of a home, and then immediately that's kind of tied to the idea of the construction of a cathedral, right? Which is some of the background context that we explore, right? That's provided for us. So we are building things. And one thing I think it does come to mind, one thing that comes to mind when we think about building is the selflessness. The fact that there's a lot of sacrifice involved in order to build anything, right? Whether it be a home, whether it be a structure, whether it be a family, whether it be a relationship, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So we're building, we're constructing here, which is important for the end of this story. Our narrator is not really big on poetry, right? Just a small little kind of literal fact of the story, but it helps us understand his attitude toward the more sensitive and explorative aspects of art, right? So keep that in mind. So this information, it almost feels like the wife's story within the first couple of pages, because we get a lot of important background. And one thing I kind of realized teaching this with my creative writing students, and I have some really astute students who really took to the story and really appreciated it, like discussing it, so it was very nice. But one thing that we find out here is she didn't dig the military industrial thing, and that's all it's really left at, right? It doesn't go into any more detail beyond that. Man, I mean, that just speaks volumes, the military industrial thing. We are living in that. I mean, just within the last few days, just you know, in terms of the real world that we live in, US kidnapped Maduro, apprehended him, whatever word you prefer. And we just see the need for military, I think almost a desperate need for military might, and no problem, right, initiating these things throughout the world here. And she was married to this officer. We find out her first marriage, young, very young, married to an officer, and he was in the military. So there is the traveling aspect. She didn't like that after a while. And I've had students, whether it be at the community college or at the high school, who have traveled quite a bit because of military parents. It can be tough, right? And we're definitely sensitive to that issue. For her, though, on top of that, the wife here, it's the military industrial thing. And when you take the military industrial thing, what that runs counter to, right, important to establish this early on, I think, is the cathedral and the religion and the religiosity and just kind of that different moral and ethical way of living, right? That seems to contrast highly with the whole military, aggressive, industrial, you know, all that kind of stuff. So I think that's why we have it here. It really does provide a clear contrast and something that drove this young woman into a state of deep depression. And also, as we find out, she tried to kill herself. And here, you know, so much of this story is focused on the narrator and his attitude, and we're like, oh my God, this guy, he's kind of a hard pill to swallow, right? But I don't want us to overlook the real hardship. I think from what we get is this young woman, right? To be driven to this point, we have a very sensitive, vulnerable person here. And I think that's what's at stake with this whole story. We take the home and we get the evidence of this. It needs to turn itself into a cathedral with the most likely of people inside, who are the people who need healing, right? And who need that help. She needs the most of all. More than Robert, who's dealing with his pains of being solo after his wonderful wife's demise, right, to cancer. We get that backstory. And more than our narrator, who just needs a major attitude adjustment. Maybe that's, you know, maybe the crucial thing for him. But she's dealing with the most, and I just want us to remember that. She needs this support, right? She needs all of it. She writes a poem every year. A lot of this is due to her involvement with Robert, and she kind of does this correspondence back and forth, and this is a part of it. Building a poem, building a structure, right? Which is a wonderful, essential way to think about poetry, right? Is that there is a structure to it, right? There's a lot that goes into it. Moving on. We always, when we read this, we have to get in a major time machine, and we got to go back pretty far because, you know, this was a thing. Recording your voice on a cassette tape and then sending that in the mail, right? Going to the post office. This was probably before UPS and all these private companies that have essentially kind of wedged their way into all of this. Go to the post office, send that off, and then that was the only way to hear somebody's voice, right? And that's why some of those early online things, especially voice ones, I would imagine, were so important, not to mention just telecommunications and things like that, and the new things that we can do. But this is just kind of, it reminds us of what you had to do in order to achieve that level of intimacy, and how important it is for these two people, the blind man after the loss of his wife especially, and the narrator's wife. Here we get a comment from the narrator, maybe I could take him bowling. And so he's trying to diminish and demean, right, the character of this blind man who he hasn't even met, which I think is important to note, right? He hasn't even met this guy. Obviously, he probably couldn't do a great job bowling. Maybe he could. You wouldn't know unless you went. Maybe he already has. Who knows? But he's trying to just, we get the idea from the narrator here that everything depends on sight. Right, and he's putting so much investment in that particular sense over everything else, right? If you didn't have your sight, God, thank goodness, that's something I have my sight. I don't have to worry about that. But if you don't, I think you also have to remember there's other senses that you just have to rely on, right? So it's kind of a presumptuous and short-sighted attitude. I didn't mean to pun on that. But there's other ways of understanding life and experience, right? There has to be, even beyond sight. He doesn't seem to really have that idea early on here. The retort from the wife is very telling. She says, you don't have any friends, right? I'm bringing over a friend. You're already kind of making this, you know, difficult. And then the irony is you don't even have any friends to bring over in the first place. And guess what? Just so that we're all, I guess, on the same page, that's irrefutable. This guy has no friends. And that's a tough thing to deal with, right? It becomes, I think, a major limitation, right, for our main character here. In fact, we're probably looking for something to remedy that. We need friends, right? We need support. Good luck going through life without it, right? It can be a very difficult journey, I would imagine. We need something there, right? Maybe sometimes we're pretty desperate to find it. We get the name of his wife who passed away from cancer, Beulah. And the name literally translates, it's Hebrew, to married or bride. So it's the perfect name for this minor character who is not in the story just by reference. But that's what she was, married bride. And let me just broaden that to partner, right? Just for the year 2026 here. Partner, somebody by my side who is, you know, ready to go through the thick and thin with me. What we say in the vows so beautifully, right? The way we lay it out, right? And describe it. But I want to just emphasize the importance of that topic and theme, partnership, right? And being with each other through all of the things that life brings to in our way. We get a lot of background. It's amazing how much background we get on other characters, whether it be Robert, his situation, or the wife, what's going on there, and we find out nothing about the main character. And maybe that's the point of the story, and like I said in the beginning of the video here, that's the point of the holidays, right? Is bringing people in and making room and learning about them, right? And listening to them and just being within their presence. And so as we hear more and more about Robert and his wife here, we get a lot of beautiful sentiment. She died in a Seattle hospital room, the blind man sitting beside the bed and holding on to her hand. That's wonderful. My goodness. My partner, I hope she does the same for me, or I do the same for her, whatever seems to happen, you know. I mean, that's what you would want. And he's seeing it from a very sardonic, almost like forcing it to be some kind of sarcastic situation, like there's some irony tied up in it. There's really not. This is a beautiful scene. Moving on, he puts so much emphasis on this guy. What a horrible thing for the wife, Beulah. You know your husband can never see you. And that's, for our narrator, the most crucial thing. He could never see how beautiful she was and compliment her based on that real noticeable beauty. But again, I think it's easily seen as pretty short-sighted, but there's other aspects to a person, how they feel, how they smell. We find out, you know, he touches the contours of a face to try to get even more of an impression, right? Which is actually, I think, pretty, you know, fairly common. So very limited here. And then at the very end, and he's got there's a certain wit to the narrator, the main character, that is just undeniable, right? You do find yourself chuckling a little bit here and there as you read it, but I think you know, you also see past it as well. But he says someone could wear makeup or not. What difference? They could wear green eyeshadow, straight pin in the nostril, purple shoes, etc. It wouldn't matter, right? How they dress. So just everything is based on sight here. The very end of that long paragraph describing their relationship and Beulah's demise, kind of Robert carrying forward. Robert was left with a small insurance policy and half of a 20 peso Mexican coin. The other coin went in the coffin with Beulah. And again, that's a wonderful thing. It shows how you can be conjoined even after the passing of a loved one, right? And you hold on to them forever, right? For that matter. And it was funny when I was reading this, one of my students, Lily, and she's just really, really awesome. We get to the end and you see the final word here that the narrator caps off this description of Robert and his wife with is pathetic, right? Pathetic. What a pathetic kind of experience. And I said, what would be after reading this and really taking time to reflect on what's being described here, what's the more appropriate word? And we came up with words like beautiful, right? And just, you know, there's something amazing about it, right? So yeah, you can easily see the attitude here of our main character. Now, one thing that kind of is a consistent thing in the story is just the drinking. And it's not just our narrator. I think it's the wife to some extent, and then also it's Robert, right? He'll have a drink or two as well. But it's actually probably more than that. I think they all drink probably a decent amount here. It seems like the tolerance levels, especially for the narrator, and you see this a lot in Carver stories because don't forget he was a struggling alcoholic. So you got these really high tolerance levels where you can just drink a lot of booze throughout the night and the night just keeps on rolling here, right? So one thing that we notice here, he, you know, looks at his wife, she's happy, she's smiling. He doesn't like it. And the reason he doesn't like it is he's not the one who brings that to his wife's life, right? Robert, we finally get the name, all right? Robert translates to shining with glory. So this idea of almost like standing on a mountaintop with the sun shining down on you and just this kind of brilliance, right? This air of brilliance. I think more helpful for us, it also translates to distinction. And we inversely, you want to just apply this to our main character. That's his main problem. He doesn't feel distinct. He doesn't feel distinctive in his wife's eyes. He's just this kind of guy, and we find out certain things about him. No friends, right? No real social thing going on. Stays home, watches a lot of TV, drinks a lot, smokes a lot of pot, right? That's basically his life. Nothing distinctive about it, whereas Robert seems to be the one who's in the spotlight, this big guest who's arriving, right? All the attention's on him. And also, to line up with that, we get such detail on the exposition, right, concerning his life, right? So he finally arrives here. We're into page 4, all right? His wife is beaming, which makes sense based on the name. It is this kind of light that's just kind of shedding on other people at this point, maybe even our narrator, right? By the time the evening is over here, this long evening, this long night here. Moving forward, right away, as he enters, I love this, and it's, you know, I think one thing I just want to say quickly why I love this story so much is it really does take, I think, for the most part, the ordinary, just a visit from an old friend, and it turns it into the extraordinary through this kind of unique, imaginative experience, right? You know, we always say reality is stranger than fiction, but I don't know. I don't know if this really was something that occurred in Raymond Carver's life, or if he did just imagine such a wonderful combination of plot details, because it's just amazing. You don't have to overdo it. And you can still provide such a richness and depth within a story. I think it's amazing. Also, I think it goes without saying, the level of dialogue is probably really hard to reach here too, because so much of this is dialogue, right? The story itself. Except for maybe the first few pages, we get a lot of exposition there. All right, moving forward. I want to emphasize this. They begin to move then a little group from the porch into the living room. And I think that's a great way to start, because our narrator, who really does feel isolated and kind of left out, and then he uses this kind of sinister kind of sarcasm to defend against that, right, to cope with that. He's part of a little group here, and that's wonderful, right? We're bringing him in right off the bat. Emphasis on guiding. She guides Robert. Robert, by the end of the story, is guiding our narrator, right? And maybe this is all to get the narrator ready to guide his wife, because we know how much she's dealing with as well, right off the bat. Robert says he sat on the right-hand side of the train, and it kind of is ironic because we wouldn't expect him to know or care, because he can't see. There's not, you know, the whole idea is that it just kind of changes the scenery, apparently, right, what you're looking at. But I think maybe in terms of symbolism, the right side of God, which is the favorable side of God, which is kind of where we're trying to get by the end of a story called Cathedral, where there's so much there's so much kind of, you know, the aspects of religion that are kind of a part of this experience, a part of the themes that we have here. So the favorable side of God here. It's almost like Robert's coming from that whole side in the first place. The wife said, "Robert, it's just good, so good to see you." Right, kind of emphasis on sight there once again. The husband here, the main character, says, she looked at Robert, she's beaming, she looked at me, right? Then she looked at me, and he says, I had the feeling she didn't like what she saw. And when we get a comment like that from a narrator here, right, it's self-degradation, right? He's kind of degrading himself, that's the first thing. But he's not even positive about it. It's not like she truly is, maybe she is, but it's just the feeling he has to begin with. So he does kind of carry this sense of shame, right, with his wife. And maybe it's because of some of the unavoidable facts of his life, what we find out about him. Maybe it's about his attitude, this constant kind of attitude that he seems to have as well. Certain things start to break down that very stereotypical, almost like movie stereotypes that we have about blind people. This guy is not using a cane, he's not wearing the dark glasses, so very different, right, compared to some of the things that we see in the media, right? And that'll happen, I think, continuously. He notices some details. It's hard to analyze some of this, I think, for like, for meaning. I don't know if it lends itself to that, but he's noticing how Robert's eyes, as a blind man, the pupils will, they operate differently, right? Especially because he's not wearing the black shades to hide these things. You just start to see him, and he does say creepy. And it seems very callous, a little judgmental to, you know, have these attitudes toward a blind man here. But I think it's maybe the narrator's way of just learning, right, through being around somebody and at least taking the time to notice certain things instead of just to be filled with preconceptions and stuff we see, on 60-second video clips, right, like we're so accustomed to these days, which probably are half the time fake, right, made not even real. But anyways, at least he's taking the time to notice some of these things. This is important. The drinking. We know it's crucial to our character. I almost feel like every time you read a Carver story, it feels like, and hopefully there's some evidence to kind of, you know, to show for this, there's the level of alcoholism, right? And one thing I noticed about the story that I didn't really notice before as I was getting ready to do a video on this, he's happy when the blind man has a drink, when he partakes in that activity, which I think brings him a lot of shame, right? This idea of just kind of drinking all the time and just sitting around and life's not going exactly the way you want it, you feel disconnected, etc. But here's this guy and he's going to do the thing that you like to do. And I think that's where we find Robert to be non-judgmental. Maybe he really doesn't want to drink. Maybe he's not the drinking type, or maybe he just doesn't feel like it, but I think he's going out of his way to try to build a connection with our narrator. And I love his reactions to it. He's like, right, I said, bub. Sure you are, I knew it. You gotta love Bub. First time I ever heard Bub was probably Wolverine. That's like his catchphrase and stuff. So especially like tied to the comic book character one, really good. But anyways, it is, Bub means friend. It's really a label of endearment, truly. So it's a connection here, and I like to see that connection early on, even if it is based on like drinking and kind of alcohol here, because it's making him feel like this guy wants something to do with me. Right? You see his reaction too, like he says, a little water with the scotch, I said, and he goes, very little, meaning he wants most of this to be straight scotch, straight alcohol, which sounds like a nightmare for me. My gosh, I'd be sleeping on the couch in about 45 minutes probably, right? And then the narrator says, I knew it. Right? He's super stoked. That was what I wrote here. He's just so stoked about it. And it is interesting to see that this is one of the, I think one of the crucial links, one of the crucial connections is this alcohol, right? That seems to continue throughout the night here. However, eventually it shifts to a little marijuana, right? Which is interesting. And I think that could be a transition of some kind. It's all about the touch. This guy's constantly, I just shaved. I had a little bit of a scruff going. And then I was like, you know what, we'll just shave it. So I'm very smooth shaven here. But the blind man, Robert, has a beard, and it reminds us of the importance of touch, the other senses, right? That it can be important to a person, to a relationship, right? To two people, the other senses, right? That we rely on, right? That enrich our lives as well. Drinking. Every time they like move on to a new topic of conversation, it's another drink. Like I said, if you don't drink, you'd probably be sleeping somewhere by this point, right? Hopefully okay. He has this preconception that why would a blind person smoke cigarettes? I can kind of relate to that. I smoked in my youth, like 15, 16, 17, a little beyond that, I would say. But for me, it really was aesthetic. That's why they did it in the movies. That's why you had like James Dean rolling up the cigarettes in the sleeve and this, you know, blowing it out of our mouths. It does have a visually aesthetic quality to it. And he's thinking, why would a guy want to do that? But again, it just reminds us that there's more to experience outside of just the visual, right? There's a lot more to it. In fact, the visual might limit you from what you're really trying to get from it. Now, this is nice. They're about to eat dinner. And, you know, whatever, the narrator acts like he's about to say a prayer, right? He's like, all right, I'm going to say a prayer here. And then I'll just read, my wife looked at me, her mouth agape. She's like, and then he makes a joke out of it before he goes on to like do an actual prayer, which would have been a very different moment, right? Thank God, thank Jesus for this food, this time, whatever, our family, opportunity, whatever it's going to be, right? I don't say much prayers, I would be honestly at the table. But anyways, it doesn't go in that direction. Instead, he says, pray the phone won't ring and the food doesn't get cold. So he kind of trivializes the whole idea of being grateful, right? He kind of trivializes the idea. He submits to the act or the process of gratitude, but I think this is the mere beginnings of doing that. The narrator begins this process as a joke, right? It starts like, even the wife is like, really? You're about to do what? So it starts as a joke, so then the wife is kind of shocked by it, but this could be the subtle beginning of this transformation. I think this is, because don't forget, we're headed to a cathedral. We're going to be in a cathedral by the end of the story. That's the beauty of it, right? That Carver kind of puts together here. And I think that's where it starts, with this kind of joke at the kitchen table. There is, after this, it's a wonderfully written paragraph. It's like got the quick sentences, right? Kind of the quick pacing to it. They eat like crazy. They eat like animals. And I don't know if this is to take us back biblically to who we are, right? On this earth, we're animals. There's more and more evidence of this every day, it seems. But they go all out on this food, right? They're going to definitely have some big bellies, right, by the end of this meal. There is the drinking of milk, which represents a kind of nourishment, maybe even kind of reminds us of some maternal qualities, maybe what's kind of needed here. Another way, if you're looking at this from a biblical kind of perspective, could be, it feels like a Last Supper. Something before a big event, something before a giant transformation, right, that will impact this world. That could be it too, right? Something like a Last Supper. They make this big mess, they ate all this food, and they just left it all, which kind of feels gluttonous, right? So maybe some biblical arc is taking place here, like we're going through it, right? And we just went through like maybe some of the more gluttonous aspects of humanity here. Important. After dinner, everyone's just talking, but not our narrator. It's a lot of listening, right? Maybe he feels left out, or maybe this is maybe a part of this kind of process that he's involved with here, which is starting to, learn more about others. But at the same time, he wants to hear his name, and that's where we go back to the meaning of the name Robert, which meant distinction. Or distinctive, and here we recognize that's what our narrator is lacking. He's not distinctive. There's nothing of merit. There's nothing to talk about. There's nothing of interest, right? But all they're talking about is their own lives, right? More talk of Robert. And he is, I love this, a regular, if he would have left it as a regular jack of all trades, of course he's using kind of a cliched, it could have worked, but to move it to a blind jack of all trades, right, is just, I think, really good writing. And kind of expresses some of that sarcasm, that wit that this guy seems to have in spades, in my opinion. And now at the end, and I think this is open to interpretation, you get, I think, the only use of parentheses in the entire story. And they're based on questions that are being directed toward the narrator, that Robert would ask. For instance, did I like my work? And then in parentheses it says, I didn't. So when I talked about this with my students, I said it's kind of unclear. Is he responding and saying, I didn't like my job, or is that more just the internal thinking that seems to be very arresting for him? He can't even talk about these things, right? These can be hard things. You don't like your job? That's not easy to talk about and open up with, because it might deal with all kinds of issues of pride and acceptance and things like that. Who knows? Was I going to stay with it? What were the options? Like, there are no options, right? That's the way perhaps the economy is designed, especially with healthcare and how you get it through your jobs. It becomes almost impossible to try to go somewhere else or find a different job because there's so much at stake, especially if you have a family. It becomes very difficult. What are my options, right? I'm unhappy and I can't do anything about it, right? I'm stuck. That's life, man. And this is the hard stuff for our narrator, right? Is not being able to feel distinctive, happy, perhaps. Maybe that's a big part of distinction, is just trying to feel happy with your circumstances. So I don't know. I'll leave it up to you. I'd love to know what you think. Are these direct replies, or are these just in his mind? And are the responses something else? All this is left quite vague, right? We don't know exactly what was occurring here. We don't get the clear dialogue. Moving on. Another stereotype is nullified, which is he loves to watch TV. Obviously, there's the sound quality to it, but then he even has a color TV, which you would think doesn't make sense, because why would a blind person need the aspect of color? But for him, it's the feeling of it, right? Maybe I feel like I'm connected to something more modern or something more, who knows, even transparent, right? Who knows? But he likes to put on his color TV set, right? And maybe we can analyze the idea of color a little bit more too. This kind of vivacity, this warmth, or something that's needed for the narrator's life here, based on what we're finding out.